So I wanted to kind of start my presentation with a question. How many of you had a cup of coffee this morning? It's kind of what I guessed. So with that in mind, my project is a research piece about coffee. I think that it's something that's an interesting example of something that we all interact with every day that we maybe don't think about a lot, but there's a lot that goes with it. So the project was inspired. I did a study abroad program in Australia and was introduced to the travel writing genre there through a BU abroad program. And while I was there, I wrote an op-ed about the relationship between Australian coffee culture and Australian values. There are larger kind of cultural differences between the States and when I was living there. Many people don't know this, but Starbucks has failed there. They're closing branches, and there's actually only 2 left, and they're in the major tourist areas. So something to think about. Second part was I went to London to study abroad again, and I noticed the same thing. Every country I went to had a different way of addressing the culture of whatever it was, a coffee house, a coffee shop, a cafe, something in that genre that I sort of invented because I don't know if it existed before me. Just kidding. Then the third part is you and me. So like I mentioned, I think coffee or whatever hot beverage you choose to consume in the morning, or a cold beverage because we're in Massachusetts and everyone drinks iced coffee, forgot about that, is kind of something that you can look at and be like, okay, well, what does this say? So in the entrance of my Keystone, I did a research project about the history of the cafe in a couple countries in Europe. And for the interest of this 10-minute presentation, I'm going to just tell you guys the story of the coffee house in England specifically. This is a quote from Ernesto Illy, who is the owner of Illy Coffee Company, who kind of revolutionized espresso and the cafe. And one of my favorite parts is he says, only coffee produces alertness and relaxation, and this is what makes coffee so magic. And in his cute little Italian voice, he's like this little old man. It was extra nice. So, the Great British Coffee Shop. The coffee shop in England was sort of founded more as a coffee house model, and coffee first came to England through not London, but Oxford. The first coffee house was founded in 1650 in Oxford by Jacobs, who was a Lebanese Jew. That's the only name we have for him, just Jacobs. It could be first name, last name, we don't really know. And in that location, there is still a cafe today. It's called the Grand Cafe. It's on High Street in Oxford. Anthony Wood, the antiquary of Oxford, released a piece in his notes, and it said that in the year 1651, so 1650, 1651, we don't really know, Jacob the Jew opened a coffee house on the Angels in parish of St. Peter in the East Oxon, and there was by some a novelty. So the idea of coffee as a novelty was how it was first sort of introduced. The next place that we saw coffee pop up was in London, on St. Michael Street in the proper city of London, which is the 1 square mile where all the banks and things are located now. And it was opened by a guy named Pascal Rosé, who was a Greek worker for a Turkish trader, and he likely opened the shop in the first floor of his boss's house. He was serving it to the people that would come in from business meetings, and they loved it so much that he was told to kind of make it a business, and so they opened it up. He also released a handbook extolling the virtues of the coffee beverage, which is what you see right there. That's the actual image of the handbill that was released in 1652. And in there, he talks about the health benefits of coffee, some of which are a bit more dubious, but also representing the truer ones as well. So some of the things he said that coffee could do is cure headaches, which for me, I'm an addict now, so withdrawal, it does cure my headaches. But he also gave it credit for curing coughs, consumption, and gout as well. Maybe a little bit more doubtful. But he also explained in the handbill that it will hinder sleep and suggested not drinking it at night unless you wanted to remain awake for 3 to 4 hours. In the next 50 years, over 2,000 coffee shops were suddenly opened in London. So this industry boomed in London, and now I'm sure there's even more than that. But that doesn't mean that it didn't start to face some resistance, and that did sort of start to happen with first women. Coffee houses in London and in England more broadly were reserved for men. They were men's clubs. And so in 1674, so after they've been open for about 25 years, the women of London specifically released this handbill, or a petition. It was called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, presenting to public consideration the grand inconvenience of crowding the other sex, so the idea of its impact on men. They said in this that the coffee caused the men to dry up radical moisture, it eunuched their husbands, and crippled their kind gallants. So there you go. the only women that were allowed in coffee houses were the women that worked there, and that was meaning in two ways. You had women who were serving and also women who were engaging in more illicit behaviors on the upper floors. The men released a response, which looked like this. And they said they were vindicating their own preferences for the virtue of that liquor from the undeserved apprehensions of the woman. And their statement claimed that the coffee made the erection more vigorous, the ejaculation more full, and added a spiritual ascendancy to the sperm. So, you know. The next person to take issue with coffee was King Charles II. This lovely looking guy right here. He was the first monarch restored to the monarchy after the rule of Oliver Cromwell under the Commonwealth. So he had very good reason to be concerned about uprising. Coffee houses in England were one of the first examples of a public sphere in England. And the public sphere is designed to, is hard to define, but most people consider it as a place where public issues can be discussed sensibly, and that keyword is sensibly. You had public houses, but they were serving ale or wine, and there's much less sensibility when you introduce those, characters. In 1675, Charles released a proclamation by the king for the suppression of coffee houses. And in it, he mentioned first that it was dangerous, going off of the health benefit issue. People had started to doubt whether or not coffee was maybe as healthy as rosé had presented in the earlier years. But he also mentioned that it was facilitating the discussion of malicious and scandalous reports of the king. This bill kind of went up within about a week. It was looking like we were going to have another overthrow of the monarchy in England, and so 2 days before it was due to take effect, his advisors convinced him that maybe that wasn't the best move, and he backed down. And so we never actually had a banning of coffee houses in England, although it did happen in many other countries across Europe. In England specifically, coffee houses also had a very distinctive economic impact in the sense that they were the root of a lot of the very well-known economic industry, kind of big, heavy hitters that we see today. So one example is that is actually Lloyd's of London very early on. If anyone knows Lloyd's of London now, that they have that big crazy building where the outside is on the inside, or the inside is on the outside. I'm sorry, it doesn't make any sense. Totally crazy, but it used to be a beautiful old building. Lloyd's Coffee House opened on Tower Street in 1688, the same year as the Glorious Revolution happening in England. So Charles II not only was the first monarch restored, his successor was then also booted. So he had a lot of reason to be panicked about anything that gave him a situation where he might get overthrown. It was opened on 16 Lombard Street, which is, originally it was opened on Tower Street, and then it moved to 16 Lombard Street, which put it closer to the water and closer to where the traders were happening. The way that it became Lloyd's of London, the insurers that we see today, is that Edward Lloyd, would prepare ship's lists for the underwriters. So he would create lists of all the things going on the ship for those people, and then in the years that developed into an full insurance business. And so whether or not there's a Lloyd's coffee shop anymore, no, but we do have this major institution, and they're reputably the ones that insure J-Lo's legs, so important. However, I know that I've been standing up here talking about coffee and England for so long, and most of you are probably going, but what about tea? In the middle to later part of the 17th century and early 18th century, tea started to take over in London for a few reasons. It was easier to make. You could make it in the home. You didn't have to grind the coffee beans. It wasn't as messy. It became a domestic part of Victorian life, which kind of fit better into the Victorian model for the family, because they could do it at home. It became a family affair. Tea rooms started coming up, and coffee houses in London became men's clubs, private men's clubs. The reason you don't see these coffee houses anymore is because rather than becoming modern coffee shops, most of them, especially in London, became private gentlemen's clubs. Another reason for the tea trade, or for tea, is because the English had a sort of monopoly on the tea trade coming out of the East Indies, so they were able to get it to their country faster. And why do you think we drink so much coffee here? Because we stopped drinking English tea. So there you go. Look at all the little kids in their dresses. And so what about today? Today in London and in most of England, you see a very similar coffee culture to what we have here in the States. Lots of students on laptops, lots of sort of fast casual style restaurants that serve coffee. And it sort of has just become normal. But the reason that I think the history of the coffee shop in England in particular is important is because you can see how it, so many years ago, has now caused a dramatic impact today. You know, you have all these major industries that came out of it. And it just comments on a lot of the major social trends that were going on at the time. And I think that continues to happen. So what's next? This research paper, in theory, is going to be the foundation for a longer form book that I want to write. I think the travel writing genre is something that's underexplored, especially as we are going into a more global culture. The more we know about other cultures and other people, the better off we're going to be. And looking at something as simple as coffee can give you a really good idea of what those people are thinking about. So that's it. Oh. Airplanes. Does anybody have questions about anything? Yeah?
So, do tea houses ever gain the same sort of notoriety for any period of time as coffee?
Yeah. So tea rooms in England have like their own sort of distinct part of culture, and they sort of came into fashion and vogue at the turnaround point when coffee houses kind of stopped having their moment, and they still exist in a way that coffee houses in the Old English style don't. So they're kind of still having their moment, but they're associated very largely, I think, with sort of like the Victorian and post-Victorian era in a way. Coffee houses were sort of earlier. Yeah.
You mentioned that Starbucks has failed in Australia. Have you seen in any other countries that you studied a distancing from coffee that is sort of opposite of what we've seen here in the States?
So not particularly. I did choose countries. So the other countries that I wrote about in the research are France, Italy, Sweden, and Amsterdam, or the Netherlands. I just only talk about Amsterdam the whole time. And I chose those countries because they have some sort of close relationship. So in Sweden, they have a word, fika, and that word it's a coffee break. It's a noun. We obviously don't have a direct translation there. So it's kind of an interesting example of like their close relationship. So in Australia, it isn't so much that they're distancing themselves from coffee, they're distancing themselves from corporate coffee. The Australians value the sort of experience, or based on my interactions with my bosses and stuff in my internship, they value the experience of going to a different coffee shop and having a slightly different experience. The barista at the coffee shop below my office was an extra in Lord of the Rings, and that was like all he talked about, like all the time. But we all knew that because we would go in and chat with him and like have conversations rather than like running in and like mobile ordering my Starbucks to running to class and like grabbing the coffee and running. It's an experience sort of situation versus where we look at it as sort of a commodity that we like run for and grab. So coffee is also the second most valuable legally traded commodity in the world after oil. So. Yeah. All right. Thank you.